how's it going? Forrest here. Can you believe it? After all this time, I actually didn't analyze all the chorale harmonizations. I actually found one while I was putting together a secret project for my channel that slipped through the cracks. It's from the Christmas oratorio. It's called Ach, mein herzliebes Jesulein. I gotta go back and retitle it too because I missed a Z in there. And that translates to, dearest Jesus, holy child. Unfortunately, it's not the most remarkable chorale. It has quite a decent amount of harmonic activity, but all in all, it's fairly straightforward. Nothing super remarkable. Everything's pretty much by the books. It's kind of an interesting suspension figure towards the end of the chorale, but we're just going to hop right into it. We have two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major. We end on D major, so I reckon that our overall key is D major. However, I'm going to make the argument that we start in the key of A major here because we immediately see G sharps after the first beat of the first complete measure, and you could make an argument that we start off in D and we have a very quick movement to A. I think it's really just semantics at that point. I'm just going to save some trouble and say that we are hearing at least the first half of the first phrase in the key of A major, and this D major chord is our subdominant or our 4. This A is a chord tone of the next chord, and we have this sort of false suspension looking thing here with this passing seventh that looks like it's a downward resolve. Like if you didn't look closely, you would think that this was a suspension, but this is an octave resolving down to a seventh, which isn't functionally a suspension. I think with our modern sensibilities, we could treat it as a suspension because G sharp is a chord tone, major 7 chord, but in Bach's time, typically not how tonic triads are treated. A major is just going to be our 1 here. However, we do have a proper lower suspension here in the bass where we have like a 9-10 suspension, or sorry, what would that be? 11-12 suspension underneath the tenor, and 9-10 suspension under the soprano here. But this G sharp is our chord tone. We have G sharp, D, F sharp, and B, which is G sharp minor 7 flat 5. That's our 7 chord in root position, 7-7. And then we get our tonic triad here, A, C sharp, E, and C sharp, A major. And I think this is where we move to D major. It's pretty clear because we have G natural happening here as a passing 7th in the bass. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're moving to the key of D major, but if you look and see that there is no more G sharp presence happening in the bass and the tenor on the next beats, it's pretty clear that we've moved to the key of D major here, and A is now operating as our dominant. We then have F sharp, D, F sharp, and A. With that passing 7th in the bass, we would expect a resolution to a 1 chord in first inversion. Some passing tones here in the middle voices, which technically leaves us with an F sharp minor 7 chord, F sharp, C sharp, E, and A. So I will mark that because it is complete, but I think it's more coincidental than anything else. I wouldn't put too much stake in that being like a functional chord. It's just a coincidental passing chord, as is the case with most chords that only have 2 voices moving on the offbeat. We then have G, B, D, and B, which is G major. That's our subdominant. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, which leaves us with F sharp, A, D, and B. Another one of these sort of third relationship with the bass, or third relationship between the roots of the chords. Excuse me, that was kind of a tongue twister, where we have a B minor 7 over F sharp, which is 6-4-3 in the key of D major. Another passing chord, again, 2 voices moving. I think really what's happening here is just some counterpoint happening where the rhythm is being imitated in the lower voices after the middle voices. And then we have E, G, E, and C sharp. That is C sharp diminished over E, which is 7-6. And then we have our tonic D, A, F sharp, and D. I'm going to call this a perfect authentic cadence. You might say it's an imperfect authentic cadence because a perfect authentic cadence needs to have both the tonic and the melody and preceded by the 5 chord, but I don't really think it's the 5 chord that makes it the perfect authentic cadence. I think it's the dominant to the tonic with the tonic and the melody, and this is definitely satisfying those criteria. Alright, next phrase, no modulations. We're just cadencing in the key of D major, but we have them with an imperfect authentic cadence. Kind of an interesting structure here where we have a perfect authentic cadence followed by an imperfect authentic cadence in like a role reversal. Grammatically speaking, we usually expect the perfect authentic cadence to happen at the end of the 2-phrase structure because it kind of operates like a period, and an imperfect authentic cadence is kind of equivalent to a comma. So it's interesting to see them flipped. We start things off with D, A, F sharp, and D. No need to remark. Passing tones in the bass and the alto here, which leaves us with E, A, G, and D. Not an analyzable chord in Bach's time, so we're not going to mark it. We have F sharp, D, A, and D, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral here if you don't want to. Passing tone in the alto, and then we have F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is another tonic triad and first inversion respelled. There's some movement in the upper voices. Passing tone in the bass here. Then we have A, C sharp, E, and A. That's A major, R dominant. And then we have A, C natural, D, and F sharp, which is D7 over A. That's a secondary dominant, 5, 4, 3 of 4. If you voice your tonic with a dominant seventh, it's just the dominant of the subdominant. D7 wants to resolve to G in Bach's sort of tonal language. It doesn't have to, but when we're thinking about it as its role as a dominant, that's where it wants to go, because it is the 5 of G major. And on the end of the beat, we get that resolution. 3 voices are moving. That's typically indicative that there's a chord happening on the offbeat, a subdivided chord progression, as I've called it in the past. And that's a G major chord. So it resolves the way we would expect. Then we get F sharp, A, D, and A, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. Passing tone in the bass, D, A, E, and G. I think this D is an accented passing tone, some type of accented non-chord tone, where C sharp is actually our chord tone here, which would leave us with A7 over C sharp, that's 5, 6, 5. And then we get D major, D, A, D, and F sharp. Also, while it's on my mind, this chorale does have instrumental interludes in between the phrases and instrumental accompaniment throughout, so the chorale itself gives the whole harmonic picture, theoretically speaking, but there's lots of richness and counterpoint going on when you factor in the instruments as well. But there's like 4-bar interludes or 2-bar interludes. It's the reference material that I was listening to before analyzing the chorale took it kind of slow, so it felt like a longer period of time, but there were probably 2-bar phrases to intersperse between the chorale parts. Alright, going into the B section here. If you could even really call it a B section, they kind of feel like 4 independent phrases, but I'm going to call it the B section because we have sort of 2 symmetrical systems here. This is a phrase that ends in the key of A major, and we get a modulation kind of over this chromatic bass line here, but I'm going to say that it happens before the chromaticism, because if we look at where the D sharp resolves to E, if we were in the key of D major, I think we would resolve to E minor, not E major. So the fact that we're seeing D sharp resolve to an E major chord, it's indicative that we're moving to A major, or at least A major is the pronounced center of the next material that we're going to listen to. We're going to analyze as well. So I'm going to say that the modulation happens here on the pickup to that bar. We have D, A, D, and F sharp, which is another tonic triad. It also happens to be, our 4 chord in the key of A major. We have a passing tone here in the alto. D sharp, A, F sharp, and B. It's B7 over D sharp, which is another secondary dominant, 5, 6, 5 of 5 this time, because B is the dominant of E. Then we have E major, E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our 5 chord. And then we have a passing 7th in the bass that takes us to what we would presume to be a tonic triad and first inversion, which is what we get. C sharp, A, E, and A. 1, 6. Then we have 4 tones moving off of the harmonic rhythm, which means that we're subdividing the chord progression here. B, D, G sharp, and B, which is G sharp diminished over B, 7, 6. And if you are privy to this progression, or if you've watched my videos in the past, you know that Bach was constantly using this chord progression in his chorale writing. We have a tonic triad and a first inversion tonic triad sandwiching a 7-6 chord. It could happen in either direction depending on the movement in the bass. In this case, it's moving down by step, so we would expect a tonic triad and root position here. A, C sharp, A, and C sharp. Spelled interestingly with 2 roots and 2/3, but it's not uncommon for Bach to do that. We then have F sharp, A, and D, which is our, no longer our tonic triad, it's our subdominant in first inversion. passing tones in 3 of the voices, the lower voices in the melody. E, C sharp, A, and C sharp. That's a tonic triad, second inversion. I'm going to mark that because 3 voices are moving. That's typically indicative that there's a subdivided chord progression happening, but the fact that we're moving close to a cadence and we're seeing a 1-6-4 chord kind of means that it's most likely operating in some type of cadential fashion. Doesn't always mean that, but in this case, the 1-6-4 chord is in pretty close proximity to a dominant, and it's happening in passing. So those are 2 green flags for 1-6-4 chords being used in context. We then have D, F sharp, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over D. We know that Bach loves his 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. We then get E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord. So this really is a subdivided chord progression here happening over the course of these 2 beats. And then we cadence on our tonic, A major, A, C sharp, E, and A. Alright, moving on to our last phrase. Perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, as we would expect a chorale to end with. We start the phrase off with a little bit of ambiguity. This is sort of where I think the most interesting part of the analysis takes place. We have B minor to start things off. We have this 9th leap in the bass 2. There is a pause, of course, and there's probably some lead in with the instruments to make this not as awkward of a jump. Leaping a 9th can be kind of difficult to do. It's not the most intuitive interval because an octave is fairly intuitive, but then adding a second on top of that is kind of difficult to do instantaneously, but a trained vocalist can do it probably pretty easily. We have B, D, F sharp, and B, which is it's our 2 chord, B minor, in the key of A major. I'm going to make the argument it's our 6 chord in the key of D major. We don't see G natural until beat 2 of the next bar, but we didn't. It's more just about context here. If we went from B minor to A major, where A major is operating as our tonic, that would be a 2-to-1 progression, and that's not really the most typical chord progression that we see in Bach's writing. We have seen a handful of them where there's no arguing against them. They are there. You can't argue it. But in this case, it would be kind of interesting if we're just looking at the downbeats and we have 2 going to 1, especially after a cadence. Kind of interesting. There's some red flags there from a normative standpoint. And despite Bach being a composer who jam-packs his chorales with harmony, he still uses mostly normative harmony. So that being said, we have E here, we have B here, that's a chord tone, E, which is an on-chord tone and anticipating the next beat, and D could be kind of analyzed as an E minor 7 chord without the 3rd, but without the 3rd, the chord's androgynous. If it's a minor or major triad, we don't know. If there was a G sharp here, that would tell us whether we were in the key of D major, or if we were in the key of A major, but we don't. So, yeah, it's very possible that this A is our pivot point because this E is sort of implying a dominant chord, and in fact, maybe there's an instrument that's providing that context for us, but we don't have it here engraved in the score. So that being said, actually, that is a good point. We do have, it looks like 2. Yeah, you know what, I just convinced myself, and sorry for the shaky screen, I think my desk is on its last leg here. I am going to say 5 with a question mark here, just because it really does look like 2 going to 5 going to 1, and we are just coming out of a subdivided harmonic rhythm too. So I'm going to say that this is 1, and then the key of D major turns into 5, but the modulation is definitely happening at one of these 2 places. We then have E here. This B is a 9/8 suspension happening over the bass, and in typical Bach fashion, he changes another contextual tone to re-spell the chord as the suspension happens, so it doesn't really feel like a fully resolved chord. And what we get here is F sharp, A, and C, which is kind of like a 3/6 chord that happens if you're counting the suspension's subversion as its own chord. But like I said, with these parenthetical chords, when there's only 2 voices moving, it's mostly just passing. And if there's a harmony that you can extrapolate or analyze out of the texture, it's not it's to be taken with a grain of salt. It's where you see 3 voices or 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm that you know there's a subdivision happening pretty much definitely. So then we have D, A, F sharp, and B. Does kind of justify this 3 chord because that would make this a 6/5 chord, B minor 7 over D. And then we get our G natural, so we know by this point we're most likely in the key of D major. We also have G natural here in the bass, non-chord tone, non-chord tone, non-chord tone. This gives us E minor over G, it's 2/6. We have a cycle of 5th progression here, 3/6/2. We would expect that to go to some type of 5 chord and then to some type of 1 chord, and that's exactly what's happening here. G, A, C sharp, and A. It's an incomplete 5/4/2 chord, A7 over G, but it's missing the 5th of the chord, which as far as structural analytical tones are concerned, it's the least important. It is contextually a tone that's part of the A major triad, but in a 7th chord, if you're taking tones out of the texture, the 5th is probably the one that's going to have the least amount of impact on being able to identify the structure of the chord, because the 3rd is needed to know the the quality of the chord, right? If it's major or minor, and the 7th is also imperative to that as well, if we know if its function is dominant or more of a stable harmony. So on the end of the beat we have 2 tones, some neighbor tones, F sharp, A, D, and A, and this is one of those 2 voice cases after my rambling that I just went on with about 2 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm and how that's not usually a signal of it being a chord progression, but in this case I do think it is a chord progression when we have 5/4/2 going to 1/6. It's a normative chord progression. The 4/2 chord resolves down by step, and that's to the 3rd of the tonic triad. We then have G, G, B, and B, another 2 root 2/3 spelling of chord here. That's G major, it's our subdominant. Then we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm. We have A, F sharp, C sharp, and A. That's a F sharp minor over A, which is 3/6, and we see that pattern where we have 2 chords that are adjacent to one another root-wise, but the middle chord is in first inversion, similar to our 1/6/7/6/1 progression. We would expect a 4/6 chord to happen after this 3/6 chord, which is what happens. B, D, D, and G, 4/6. And then we get G here, which is a chord tone, F sharp, which is a passing 7th. Maybe this is a root position, G major 7 chord that just happens as a byproduct of the voices moving the way that they do. But like I said, with 2 voice passing chords, take them with a grain of salt unless there is real justification for them, which does happen as we saw here, but most of the time it's more coincidental than not. Then we have A, D, and E, this D being a 4/3 suspension over the bass. We know that a 5/7 chord's being implied because by the time the C sharp is resolved to, we get G and we have A moved down in the bass. It's the same tone, so we analyze the chord the same, and E is static in the melody before we resolve to D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. Tonic triad, root position. All in all, very straightforward chorale. We have kind of an interesting suspension figure going on here. We have a little bit of ambiguity in terms of where the modulation happens, but like I said, because there are instruments in this chorale, it probably clears up what kind of chords going on here. Probably have a higher voice contextualizing, or maybe even a middle voice contextualizing this E chord as major, and then we're modulating over the A, but I think analyzing it without the context as a modulation here over the B minor chord also works. But yeah, that being said, that's the last chorale. That really is the last chorale until I go and check to see if there were more chorales that were added to the database that I was using. No videos for a while. I have started another sort of commentary video about another topic that is prevalent in the chorales, but there's no completion date for that. I'm working on another project that isn't video related at the moment. So if you're interested in following the channel as I release more content pertaining to J.S. Bach or other theory related videos that I release in the future, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for continuing to support the channel, because honestly, the channel's grown so much in the time from when I finished the journey, air quotes finished. Here I am still tacking on a couple of steps to those to that journey. Almost 1,700 subscribers. It's really crazy to think how much the channel's grown. A lot of subscribers over the couple of days where people were really observing Bach's birthday. And my journey to analyze all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations video got a ton of views. So thank you so much for continuing to support the channel. More content in the future, and be on the lookout for my surprise project at the beginning of summer. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you're doing well. Take care.